the heart of Manhattan's Lower East Side, beneath what is now a bustling commercial district, lie the forgotten foundations of one of America's most disturbing institutions. Between 1834 and 1867, the House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women operated under the iron fist of the Murphy family, claiming to rehabilitate fallen women through Christian discipline. Official records show 456 women entered those doors. Only 127 ever left alive. For over 30 years, the Murphy family perfected a system so depraved that when investigators finally breached those walls, they found evidence of horrors that challenged the very limits of human cruelty. The true story of what happened behind those sacred walls remained buried in sealed court documents for nearly a century until a construction crew in 1934 unearthed basement chambers that revealed the full scope of their operation. Before we continue with the history of Warden Patrick Murphy and his family's reign of terror, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our darkest historical mysteries. Tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. You might be surprised how close these events happened to your own hometown. What the Murphy family created wasn't just a house of correction. It was a perfectly orchestrated machine of exploitation that would make even the most hardened criminals recoil in disgust. New York City in 1834 was a powder keg of moral panic and religious fervor. The Second Great Awakening had swept through America like wildfire, leaving behind a society obsessed with sin, redemption, and the purification of souls. The city's population had exploded to over 300,000 residents, creating overcrowded tenements where poverty and desperation bred like rats in the walls. Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine that would soon devastate their homeland arrived daily in ships that dumped human cargo onto the docks like sacks of grain. It was in this climate of religious hysteria and social chaos that Patrick Murphy, a former prison guard from County Cork, Ireland, saw an opportunity that would make his family wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. Patrick Murphy was a man whose imposing 6.3 frame cast shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. His weathered hands, scarred from years of brutal work in Ireland's notorious Kilmum jail, could break a woman's wrist with the casual ease of snapping a twig. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a memento from a prisoner's desperate escape attempt that had failed spectacularly, but it was his eyes, pale blue and utterly devoid of warmth, that truly revealed the monster beneath the pious exterior. When he spoke of God's will, his voice carried the authority of a man who believed himself to be divine judgment incarnate. Patrick had learned his trade in the old country, where political prisoners and Irish rebels had taught him that every human being had a breaking point, and that breaking point could be found with the right combination of physical pain and psychological manipulation. His wife, Kathleen Murphy, had perfected the art of cruelty disguised as maternal care during her years as a workhouse supervisor in Boston's Irish Quarter. A woman of average height but extraordinary presence, she possessed the unique ability to inflict psychological torture while maintaining an expression of loving concern. Her thin lips would curve into what resembled a smile, but her dark eyes betrayed a satisfaction that bordered on the sexual when witnessing another woman's humiliation. Kathleen understood that breaking a woman's spirit required a delicate touch. Too much force, and they would retreat into madness, becoming useless for their purposes. Too little, and they would retain hope, making them dangerous. She had studied the techniques used by the Magdalenites in Ireland, where fallen women were worked to death under the guise of moral rehabilitation, and she brought those methods to America with refinements born of her own twisted imagination. Sha Murphy, Patrick's younger brother, and the institution's chaplain, brought an intellectual sadism to their unholy trinity that elevated their crude brutality into something approaching art. A failed seminary student with a brilliant mind, twisted by rejection and bitterness, Sha had been expelled from 3 different theological schools for what his professors delicately called inappropriate interpretations of Scripture. His sermons could reduce grown women to sobbing confessions of sins they had never committed, and his knowledge of human psychology allowed him to identify and exploit each victim's deepest fears and insecurities with surgical precision. Sha possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of religious texts from multiple denominations, allowing him to craft theological justifications for any atrocity using the victim's own faith against them. He had spent years studying the interrogation techniques used during the Spanish Inquisition, not out of historical curiosity, but as a practical guide for breaking human will. The family's operation expanded significantly when Patrick's eldest son, Thomas Murphy, returned from his failed attempt at establishing a shipping business in Boston. Thomas brought with him a network of corrupt politicians, police officials, and businessmen who would become essential to the family's enterprise, along with a sophisticated understanding of how money and influence flowed through New York's complex political machinery. Unlike his father's crude brutality, Thomas possessed a refined cruelty that came from his education at Harvard College and his exposure to the ruthless business practices of Boston's merchant class. Understood that true power lay not in violence, but in the systematic destruction of hope, and that the most effective way to control people was to make them complicit in their own degradation. Thomas had learned from his business failures that success required diversification and careful risk management. Lessons he would apply to the family's criminal enterprise with devastating effectiveness. The final member of this diabolical family was Mary Murphy, Patrick's sister-in-law and Kathleen's closest confidant, a woman whose own traumatic past had warped her into something barely recognizable as human. Mary had survived the horrific conditions aboard an immigrant ship where cholera had killed half the passengers, including her husband and 2 young children. The experience had left her with a profound hatred for weakness and suffering which she rationalized as divine judgment. Against the unworthy, her knowledge of herbs and primitive surgery, techniques learned from necessity during the voyage, allowed the family to keep their victims alive far longer than nature intended, prolonging their suffering with a precision that spoke to years of practice and experimentation. Mary served as the institution's medical attendant, a position that gave her access to every woman who entered their facility and allowed her to document their physical and mental condition for the family's business purposes. The House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women opened its doors on a bitter February morning in 1834, occupying a massive 4-story brick building that had previously served as a textile factory. The building's location had been carefully chosen, close enough to the city center to be convenient for clients and officials, but far enough from respectable neighborhoods to avoid unwanted scrutiny. The structure itself told the story of New York's rapid industrialization. Built in 1820 to house textile machinery, it had been abandoned when cheaper production moved to mill towns in Massachusetts, leaving behind a hollow shell perfectly suited to the Murphy family's dark purposes. The building's windows had been bricked over, except for narrow slits that allowed just enough light to navigate the corridors, but not enough for the inhabitants to gauge time or weather. This disorientation was deliberate. Without natural light cycles, the women lost track of days and weeks, making them more susceptible to manipulation and control. The Murphy family had invested heavily in soundproofing, installing thick wool insulation between the walls that muffled even the most desperate screams. The walls themselves were painted in deep dark colors that seemed to absorb what little light penetrated the building, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that crushed the spirit even before any direct abuse began. The institution's public face was that of a progressive rehabilitation center, where women guilty of prostitution, adultery, public intoxication, or moral degeneracy could find redemption through prayer, honest work, and Christian education. The Murphy family marketed their services to judges, police officials, and concerned families as a humane alternative to the squalid conditions of Blackwell's Island or the city's overcrowded prisons. They published testimonials from supposedly reformed women and distributed pamphlets describing their revolutionary methods of moral rehabilitation through Christian love and discipline. What made their operation particularly insidious was its legal foundation. New York's moral reform laws of the 1830s gave extraordinary power to religious institutions that claimed to offer rehabilitation services. The Murphy family had carefully studied these laws and crafted their charter to exploit every loophole, giving them nearly unlimited authority over the women placed in their care. Once a woman entered their facility, she essentially disappeared from the legal system until the Murphy family decided to release her, if they ever did. The laws were so broadly written that almost any behavior could be interpreted as moral corruption, requiring institutional intervention. The Murphy family's success depended on an intricate network of corruption that reached into every level of New York society, from street-level police officers to the most powerful political figures in the state. Thomas Murphy had cultivated these relationships with the patience of a spider spinning its web. understanding that each connection made the entire network stronger and more difficult to unravel. These men didn't just tolerate the Murphy family's operation. They were its most valuable customers and most essential protectors. Judge Hamilton Prescott of the Manhattan Criminal Court became one of their most reliable sources of victims, a man whose public reputation as a moral crusader provided perfect cover for his private perversions. A pillar of the Presbyterian Church and a vocal advocate for moral reform, Prescott routinely sentenced young women to the House of Religious Correction for crimes as minor as being found alone with a man after dark or speaking too boldly in public. His courtroom became a hunting ground where attractive young women, particularly those without family connections or social standing, found themselves condemned to the Murphy family's tender mercies. What the court records never revealed was that Prescott received detailed reports on each woman's treatment and paid handsomely for private sessions where he could personally oversee their rehabilitation. Prescott had developed an elaborate system of legal pretexts that allowed him to extend sentences indefinitely, keeping his favorite victims available for as long as his desires required. Police Captain Frederick Dunham controlled the flow of women into the system through selective enforcement of morality laws that were so vaguely written they could be applied to almost any woman who caught his officers' attention. His constables would target attractive young women, particularly Irish and German immigrants who lacked family connections or social standing to fight back. Dunham had developed a system of manufactured evidence that could transform any woman into a moral criminal. A love letter could become evidence of adultery. A glass of wine could become proof of habitual drunkenness, and a conversation with a male acquaintance could become solicitation. His officers were trained to look for specific types of women, those who were alone, poor, foreign, or otherwise vulnerable to false accusations. The captain maintained detailed files on eligible targets, including their daily routines, family situations, and potential weaknesses that could be exploited during arrest and prosecution. The Murphy family's clientele extended far beyond corrupt officials to include some of New York's most respected businessmen, doctors, and religious leaders. Men whose public facades of moral rectitude made their private degeneracy all the more shocking. Shipping magnate Cornelius Vanderburg maintained a standing appointment every Tuesday evening, paying the equivalent of a working man's monthly wages for the privilege of counseling the newest arrivals. Vanderburg had specific preferences that the Murphy family catered to with disgusting precision, and his wealth and influence made him effectively untouchable by law enforcement. Dr. Elias Whitfield, who served on the city's Board of Health, provided medical examinations that determined which women were suitable for the family's most lucrative services, while also ensuring that diseases contracted during their captivity didn't spread to the paying customers. Perhaps most disturbing was the involvement of Reverend Josiah Hartford, pastor of one of Manhattan's largest Methodist congregations, whose participation gave the institution an aura of legitimate religious authority that deflected suspicion for years. Hartford not only provided theological cover for the Murphy family's activities, but actively recruited victims from his own congregation. Young women who came to him seeking spiritual guidance for personal struggles found themselves declared morally corrupt and in need of intensive rehabilitation. Hartford's Sunday sermons often focused on the dangers of moral corruption among young women, creating a climate of suspicion and fear that made his congregation eager to identify and report potential victims. His endorsement carried such weight in religious circles that other ministers began referring troubled women to the House of Religious Correction without question. The Murphy family had also corrupted the city's nascent social reform movement by infiltrating organizations dedicated to helping fallen women. Mary Murphy served on the board of the Ladies' Moral Reform Society, where she identified potential victims among the women seeking help and diverted them to the House of Religious Correction. Her reputation as a compassionate advocate for women's welfare provided perfect cover for her recruitment activities, and her position gave her access to detailed information about vulnerable women throughout the city. The irony was lost on no one except the victims themselves. The very organizations designed to protect them had been turned into hunting grounds by their predators. Thomas Murphy had established financial relationships with banks and investment firms that laundered the family's profits through legitimate business ventures. The Merchants Bank of New York, under the direction of President Samuel Rothwell, accepted large cash deposits from the institution without question and invested the money in shipping ventures, real estate, and government bonds. This financial network not only cleaned their dirty money, but also gave the Murphy family legitimate income sources that could withstand scrutiny from tax collectors and investigators. Life inside the House of Religious Correction followed a carefully designed pattern intended to break down human dignity and resistance. A process that began the moment a woman crossed the threshold and continued until she either died or was broken so completely that she could never pose a threat to the operation. New arrivals were processed through an intake ritual that served as both humiliation and psychological conditioning, designed to strip away their identity and prepare them for the horrors that lay ahead. The intake process began in what the Murphy family called the purification chamber, a windowless room in the building's basement, where new arrivals were subjected to a degrading ritual disguised as medical examination and spiritual cleansing. Women were stripped naked and subjected to invasive medical examinations conducted by Mary Murphy, who claimed to be checking for signs of disease, but was actually documenting physical characteristics for the family's client records. Every detail was recorded: hair color, eye color, distinguishing marks, physical defects, and estimates of age and previous sexual experience. This information was compiled into detailed profiles that were distributed to the family's clientele, allowing them to select women based on their specific preferences. Following the physical examination came what Shaw Murphy called spiritual assessment, a psychological interrogation designed to identify each woman's fears, religious beliefs, family connections, and potential weaknesses. Shaw had developed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that allowed him to quickly identify the psychological pressure points that would be most effective for breaking each individual victim. Some women could be controlled through religious guilt, others through threats to family members, and still others through the promise of eventual release. Shaw's assessments determined not only how each woman would be treated, but also how long she could be expected to survive the process. The building's layout had been specifically designed to create psychological disorientation and prevent any sense of familiarity or control. Corridors led to dead ends, staircases went nowhere, and rooms were deliberately mislabeled to prevent inmates from developing mental maps of their environment. The Murphy family understood that confusion and uncertainty were powerful tools for maintaining control over their victims, and they had invested considerable effort in making the building as disorienting as possible. Doors were unmarked, hallways changed direction without apparent reason, and the lighting was kept deliberately dim to make navigation difficult and dangerous. Each woman was assigned a number rather than being called by name, reinforcing their transformation from human beings into commodities. Their personal belongings were confiscated and burned in a ceremony that Patrick Murphy described as casting off the old sinful self. Even wedding rings and religious jewelry were destroyed, severing the women's psychological connections to their former lives and identities. The burning ceremony was conducted with great solemnity, with Shaw Murphy delivering sermons about rebirth and purification, while the women were forced to watch their last connections to the outside world turn to ash. The daily routine was designed to exhaust both body and spirit while generating income for the Murphy family through forced labor. Women were awakened at 4:00 in the morning for 2 hours of prayer and confession, a grueling psychological session where they were forced to confess to sins they had never committed and beg forgiveness for their inherent moral corruption. These morning sessions were led by Shaw Murphy, who used them to enforce each woman's sense of worthlessness and dependence on the family's mercy. The confessions were recorded and used as evidence of the women's moral depravity, providing legal justification for their continued imprisonment. Breakfast consisted of thin gruel made from spoiled grain and stale bread, barely enough nutrition to sustain life, but insufficient to maintain strength or health. The inadequate diet was another tool of control. Hungry, weakened women were less likely to resist or attempt escape, and their deteriorating physical condition made them more dependent on their captives for survival. The Murphy family carefully calculated the minimum amount of food necessary to keep their victims alive and productive, treating nutrition as just another business expense to be minimized. The morning was spent in hard labor that generated income for the Murphy family while keeping the women too tired to planescape attempts. They operated a laundry service that contracted with local hotels and businesses, a sewing operation that produced clothing for retail sale, and a small manufacturing enterprise that made household goods. The work was backbreaking and dangerous, performed with primitive equipment in poorly ventilated spaces that reek of chemicals and human misery. Women who became too weak or sick to work were either disposed of or relegated to other forms of service that required less physical strength, but often proved even more degrading. Afternoons were dedicated to moral instruction led by Shaw Murphy, whose sermons were masterpieces of psychological manipulation designed to convince the women that their suffering was not only deserved, but necessary for their spiritual salvation. Shaw had studied the techniques used by religious interrogators during the Spanish Inquisition and adapted them for his purposes, using guilt, shame, and fear to break down psychological resistance. His afternoon sessions often lasted 4 hours, with women forced to remain standing, while Shaw detailed their moral failings and the divine judgment that their sins had brought upon them. Evenings brought the most terrifying aspect of life in the institution: the personal guidance sessions with clients, where the Murphy family's true business took place. Women were told that thesis sessions were part of their rehabilitation, that wealthy Christian men were generously donating their time to provide moral counseling and spiritual guidance. The reality was far more sinister than even the most cynical observer might have imagined. These sessions, held in specially prepared rooms in the building's basement, were where human beings were reduced to objects for the gratification of men whose wealth and social position had convinced them that other people existed solely for their pleasure. The family had developed an elaborate system for categorizing their victims based on physical appearance, personality traits, and the specific preferences of their clientele. Some men preferred broken women who had been reduced to complete submission, while others enjoyed the challenge of conquering those who still retained some spark of defiance. The Murphy family catered to every perverted desire, transforming what should have been a place of healing into a marketplace for human degradation, where women were bought and sold like livestock. What made their system particularly effective was the veneer of religious authority that covered every atrocity. Victims were told that resistance to their treatment was resistance to God's will, that their suffering was purifying their souls, and that submission to their tormentors was a form of holy obedience. Shaw Murphy's theological expertise allowed him to quote scripture in support of any abuse, no matter how depraved, convincing many victims that their torture was somehow sanctified by divine approval. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of the Murphy family's depravity, the discovery of their record-keeping system revealed an even more disturbing truth about their operations. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what horrors those meticulously kept records would reveal. The Murphy family's operation was far more sophisticated than a simple exploitation scheme. It was a carefully managed business enterprise with detailed financial records, client databases, and systematic methods for maximizing profit from human suffering that would have impressed the most ruthless robber barons of the era. Thomas Murphy, with his Harvard education and business background, had transformed his family's cruelty into a model of cold efficiency that treated human beings as raw materials to be processed and refined into profitable commodities. The family maintained 3 separate sets of books, each serving a different purpose in their elaborate deception. The first, available for inspection by legal authorities, showed modest income from rehabilitation services, charitable donations, and the sale of goods produced by reformed women learning honest trades. The second shared only with their network of corrupt officials, detailed bribes, protection payments, and the complex financial arrangements that kept their operation running smoothly. The third, hidden in a secret compartment behind a false wall in Thomas Murphy's private office, recorded their true earnings from what they euphemistically called moral guidance services. This hidden ledger, discovered decades later during renovation of the building, revealed an operation that generated the equivalent of millions in today's currency, making the Murphy family one of the wealthiest criminal enterprises in American history. Their client base was organized into membership tiers, each with different privileges and pricing structures that maximized revenue while maintaining the illusion of moral respectability. Basic membership, marketed to lower-level officials and small businessmen, allowed access to group counseling sessions where multiple clients could observe the humiliation of prisoners for a modest fee. These sessions were presented as educational opportunities, where respectable men could witness the rehabilitation process and understand the importance of moral reform. Premium memberships available to wealthier clients included private sessions with specific women, detailed progress reports, and the opportunity to participate in the design of individual rehabilitation programs. The most expensive platinum service offered clients the opportunity to participate in the intake process for new arrivals, allowing them to select their victims from among the fresh captures and specify exactly how they wished their chosen women to be reformed. The Murphy family had also developed what they called specialty services for clients with particular interests or unusual requirements. Some men paid extra to participate in the fake religious ceremonies that Sean Murphy conducted, where they could play the role of divine judgment incarnate while inflicting psychological torture on helpless victims. Others purchased the right to design specific torments for women who'd rejected them in the outside world, turning the institution into a vehicle for personal revenge, disguised as moral correction. The family even offered educational packages where clients could observe the entire process of breaking a woman's will from initial intake through final submission as a form of entertainment that satisfied their curiosity about human suffering. Thomas Murphy had established connections with similar operations in other cities, creating a network that allowed them to trade women like commodities in a market that spanned multiple states. A client who grew bored with local offerings could request someone from Philadelphia or Boston, while the Murphy family could dispose of victims who had become too broken to be profitable by shipping them to partner institutions. This interstate trade was disguised as transfers for specialized treatment and was completely legal, under the loose oversight of religious rehabilitation programs. The network also served as an early warning system, allowing the various operations to share information about potential threats and coordinate responses to law enforcement investigations. The family's most disturbing innovation was their breeding program. Though they never used such crude terminology in their carefully coded records, young women who became pregnant during their captivity were kept in special quarters in the building's attic until they gave birth, after which their children were either sold to childless couples, willing to pay substantial fees for rescued orphans, or raised within the institution to become the next generation of victims and perpetrators. The program served multiple purposes. It provided additional revenue, created a renewable source of victims, and offered clients the opportunity to participate in what Sean Murphy described as the creation of new life through moral purification. Mary Murphy oversaw this aspect of the operation with the same cold efficiency she brought to her medical duties, maintaining detailed health records on each woman that tracked menstrual cycles, pregnancies, and physical condition with the precision of a livestock breeder. Her knowledge of herbs and primitive medical procedures allowed her to terminate unwanted pregnancies or ensure successful births, depending on what would be most profitable for the family at any given time. The children born in the institution were raised in ignorance of their true origins, told that they were orphans saved from the streets by the Murphy family's Christian charity. The Murphy family had also discovered that their victims' labor could be monetized beyond the simple manufacturing work they performed during the day. Kathleen Murphy established contracts with legitimate businesses to provide reformed women as domestic servants, seamstresses, and factory workers. These women, thoroughly broken by their experiences, made ideal employees. They never complained, never stole, and never caused trouble because they had been conditioned to believe that any form of resistance would result in punishment far worse than death. The families and businesses that employed them praised the Murphy family's rehabilitation methods, not knowing that the women's compliance came from terror rather than redemption. Thomas Murphy had also pioneered what modern criminologists would recognize as an early form of human trafficking, establishing relationships with ship captains and immigration officials that allowed him to acquire fresh victims from among the desperate immigrants arriving daily in New York Harbor. Women who had survived the horrific conditions aboard immigrant ships only to find themselves alone and penniless in a foreign land were easy targets for recruitment into what they were told were respectable employment opportunities. The Murphy family's agents met incoming ships and identified vulnerable women who could be easily isolated from any potential support networks. The Murphy family's reign of terror might have continued indefinitely if not for a confluence of events in 1866 that finally exposed their operation to public scrutiny. The first crack in their carefully constructed facade came from an unexpected source. The very corruption network that had protected them for over 3 decades suddenly became a liability as political winds shifted and new reform movements gained power in city government. Detective James Flanagan of the Metropolitan Police had been investigating a series of Disappearances in the Irish neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, initially as a routine missing persons case that had attracted little attention from his superiors. Young women were vanishing at an alarming rate, and their families' desperate pleas for help had fallen on deaf ears until Flanagan's own niece, Margaret O'Sullivan, disappeared after being arrested for public intoxication following her fiancé's wake. Margaret was a respectable young woman who worked as a seamstress and had never been in trouble with the law, making her sudden arrest and disappearance particularly suspicious to her uncle's trained eye. Flanagan's investigation led him to discover irregularities in arrest records and sentencing patterns that pointed towards systematic targeting of vulnerable women. He began tracking the cases of missing women and discovered that an unusually high percentage of them had been arrested on morality charges and sentenced to the House of Religious Correction. When he attempted to visit the institution to check on his niece's welfare, he was told that she had been transferred to another facility for specialized treatment, but no records of the transfer could be produced. His inquiries made certain members of the corruption network nervous, particularly Captain Dunham, who began to fear that his role in the operation might be exposed. The situation became critical when Flanagan enlisted the help of Father Michael Alley, a reform-minded priest who'd been documenting the disappearances in his parish and had begun to suspect that something sinister was happening to the missing women. Father Ali had noticed that many of the women who disappeared were among the most devout members of his congregation, making their alleged moral corruption highly unlikely. His investigation had uncovered evidence that arrest reports were being falsified and that witnesses to the alleged crimes could not be located or had given contradictory statements. In a desperate attempt to protect himself and shut down the investigation, Captain Dunham decided to eliminate the evidence by ordering an accidental fire at the House of Religious Correction. Dunham believed that destroying the building and its contents would not only eliminate any evidence of the Murphy family's crimes, but also dispose of the witnesses who could testify against the corruption network. He arranged for a group of corrupt constables to set the fire during the early morning hours, when most of the inhabitants would be sleeping, ensuring maximum casualties and minimum chance of discovery. However, Dunham's plan backfired spectacularly when the fire spread faster than anticipated and attracted the attention of Fire Chief Michael O'Brien, an honest man who had somehow avoided corruption despite 30 years in city service. Instead of destroying evidence, the fire revealed horrors that had been hidden from public view for over 3 decades. When firefighters arrived at the burning building on the night of November 15, 1866, they expected to find a typical institutional fire with some casualties and property damage. Instead, they discovered dozens of women chained in basement rooms that didn't appear on any official building plans. Their screams audible even over the roar of the flames. Fire Chief O'Brien immediately ordered his men to break down every door and search every room, regardless of whether they were supposed to be occupied. What they found in those hidden chambers challenged their understanding of human depravity and convinced them that they had stumbled upon something far more sinister than a simple institutional fire. Women in various states of physical and mental breakdown were discovered in conditions that defied description. Some chained towels for so long that their limbs had atrophied, while others showed signs of systematic torture that had clearly been ongoing for years. The Murphy family's response to the fire revealed the true nature of their operation and demonstrated their complete lack of human conscience. Instead of showing concern for the women trapped in the building, their first priority was destroying documents and evidence that could implicate them in criminal activity. Thomas Murphy was observed by several firefighters throwing ledgers and papers into the flames while Sean Murphy attempted to lead a group of clients out through a secret tunnel that connected the building to a nearby church basement. Their panicked efforts to cover their tracks only served to confirm the firefighters' suspicions that something deeply wrong had been happening in the building. Mary Murphy's reaction was perhaps the most telling and disturbing. When firefighters found her in the basement medical facility, she was methodically poisoning the women who were too injured to move, claiming that she was putting them out of their misery to spare them further suffering. Her matter-of-fact explanation that these women couldn't be allowed to talk revealed the calculated nature of the family's cruelty and their awareness that what they had been doing was not only criminal, but so heinous that public exposure would result in immediate and severe retribution. News of the fire and the discovery of the Murphy family's victims spread through New York City like wildfire, creating a public outcry that could not be ignored, suppressed, or explained away by the usual methods of political influence and bribery. The city's newspapers, previously reluctant to investigate the institution due to its religious facade and political connections, suddenly found themselves in fierce competition to expose the most shocking details of the story and identify the prominent citizens who had been involved in the operation. The Herald's investigation, led by veteran crime reporter Samuel Jennings, revealed the extent of the corruption network that had protected the Murphy family for over 3 decades. Jennings had spent weeks tracking down financial records, interviewing survivors, and following the complex web of payments and favors that had kept the operation running smoothly. His series of articles, published over the course of several weeks, provided detailed accounts of bribes, illegal transfers, and cover-ups that reached into the highest levels of city and state government. The expose implicated judges, police officials, politicians, businessmen, and religious leaders in a conspiracy so vast and shameless that many readers initially refused to believe it could be true. Judge Hamilton Prescott, facing imminent exposure and arrest, was found dead in his chambers just hours before a warrant was issued for his arrest. He had apparently taken his own life rather than face public disgrace and criminal prosecution, leaving behind a detailed suicide note that served as a full confession of his involvement in the operation. His note, published in full by the Tribune despite its graphic content, detailed not only his own crimes, but also implicated dozens of other officials and clients. Prescott's confession provided investigators with a roadmap to the entire corruption network and gave them the evidence they needed to begin making arrests. Captain Frederick Dunham attempted to flee the city with his family, but was arrested at the harbor with a suitcase full of cash and detailed records of his payments from the Murphy family. Under intense interrogation, Dunham revealed the full scope of the operation and provided testimony that would eventually lead to over 40 arrests among city officials, businessmen, and clergy members. His cooperation was motivated not by remorse, but by a desperate attempt to reduce his own sentence, and his detailed knowledge of the corruption network made him an invaluable witness for prosecutors. The Murphy family themselves proved surprisingly difficult to capture, suggesting that they had prepared extensive escape plans for exactly such a contingency. Patrick Murphy was found dead in the ruins of the institution, apparently killed when a burning beam fell on him as he attempted to destroy evidence in the basement. However, the coroner's examination revealed that he had been struck on the head with a heavy object before the beam fell, suggesting that one of his victims had finally found the courage and opportunity to fight back. The identity of his killer was never determined, as several of the surviving women had suffered injuries that could have been sustained while defending themselves. Kathleen Murphy disappeared completely and was never found despite a massive manhunt that extended across multiple states and involved federal marshals. Some evidence suggested that she had assumed a false identity and fled to California, while other reports placed her in Europe with relatives who had immigrated years earlier. Her ability to vanish so completely suggested that the Murphy family had prepared detailed escape plans and established safe houses and false identities for use in case of discovery. Several women matching her description were arrested in various cities over the following years, but none proved to be the elusive matriarch of the Murphy family. Sean Murphy was captured 3 days after the fire at a monastery in upstate New York, where he had sought sanctuary from church authorities who initially believed his claims of persecution by anti-Catholic forces. His arrest was complicated by his clerical status and the church's traditional protection of clergy members, but the evidence against him was so overwhelming that even the most conservative bishops could not justify offering him sanctuary. During his trial, Shaw's testimony revealed the elaborate theological justifications he had crafted for the family's activities, providing a chilling insight into how religious authority could be perverted to serve the most unholy purposes. Thomas Murphy's capture was perhaps the most dramatic and significant, as he possessed the detailed business records that would allow prosecutors to unravel the entire operation and identify all of its participants. He had fled to his shipping contacts in Boston and was attempting to book passage to Europe when Detective Flanagan tracked him down through a network of informants and fellow officers. Thomas had with him a collection of photographs, documents, and ledgers that provided evidence of the family's clients and business operations stretching back to the institution's founding. His arrest led to a series of prosecutions that stretched across multiple states and exposed similar operations in other cities. Mary Murphy was found in the basement medical facility, having apparently suffered a complete mental breakdown that left her unable to understand the reality of her situation. She was discovered sitting calmly among the bodies of the women she had poisoned, singing lullabies and brushing their hair as if they were still alive. Her trial was brief, as she was clearly unable to understand the charges against her or assist in her own defense. She spent the remainder of her life in an asylum where she continued to insist that she had been helping the women achieve peaceful redemption and seemed genuinely confused by the accusations leveled against her. The trials that followed the Murphy family's exposure became a sensation that captivated the entire nation and revealed the shocking extent of corruption and moral hypocrisy that had allowed such horrors to continue for over 3 decades. The courthouse was packed daily with spectators eager to hear the shocking testimony of survivors and the confessions of corrupt officials. While newspaper reporters from across the country flocked to New York to cover what many considered the crime of the century, survivor testimony painted a picture of horror that was almost too terrible for civilized minds to comprehend. Yet the evidence was so overwhelming and consistent that even the most skeptical observers were forced to accept its truth. Women described years of systematic abuse, watching friends disappear, never to be seen again, and being forced to participate in degrading acts that were presented as religious ceremonies. Their accounts revealed the sophisticated psychological techniques the Murphy family had used to break their will and maintain control over them. Methods that combined physical brutality with mental manipulation in ways that challenged contemporary understanding of human psychology. Margaret O'Sullivan, Detective Flanagan's niece, was among the survivors rescued from the fire, and her testimony was particularly powerful because she had been in the institution for less than a year and could still articulate the methods used to break down new arrivals. Her description of the intake process and the systematic stripping away of identity and dignity provided crucial evidence for the prosecution, while her detailed account of the daily routine revealed how the Murphy family had perfected the art of maintaining control through exhaustion, humiliation, and false hope. Margaret's testimony was especially damaging because her background as a respectable working woman contradicted the Murphy family's claims that their victims were naturally depraved individuals who required harsh treatment. Elizabeth Carmichael, a former schoolteacher who had spent 3 years in the institution after being falsely accused of adultery by a rejected suitor, provided testimony that revealed the scope of the Murphy family's client network. Her education and articulate manner made her an ideal witness, and her detailed recollections of conversations with clients exposed the involvement of prominent citizens who had believed their identities were protected by the institution's veil of secrecy. Elizabeth's testimony revealed that many clients had specifically requested women of certain backgrounds or professions, turning the institution into a catalog service for those wealthy enough to afford custom degradation. The trial also exposed the complicity of New York's social and religious elite in the Murphy family's crimes, revealing a level of moral corruption that shocked even the most cynical observers. Prominent businessmen who had presented themselves as moral reformers were revealed to be regular clients of the institution, their names appearing repeatedly in Thomas Murphy's detailed client records. Religious leaders who had preached about the salvation of fallen women were shown to have been actively involved in their exploitation, using their moral authority to identify and recruit victims for the Murphy family's operation. Reverend Josiah Hartford's trial was particularly scandalous because of his prominence in the Methodist community and his reputation as a moral crusader. His defense attorneys attempted to portray him as a well-meaning minister who had been deceived by the Murphy family's false claims of rehabilitation, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Survivors testified that Hartford had personally participated in their abuse, using his theological knowledge to craft elaborate justifications for their suffering. His own journal seized during his arrest revealed a man who had long since abandoned any pretense of Christian morality and viewed his victims as objects created by God for his personal gratification. The business records seized from Thomas Murphy provided evidence of the operation's financial scope and revealed connections to similar institutions across the country, exposing a network of exploitation that had operated under the cover of moral reform for decades. The records showed that the Murphy family had been in contact with operators in Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and other major cities, sharing techniques, trading victims, and coordinating their activities to avoid law enforcement attention. This revelation led to investigations in multiple cities that uncovered similar operations, though none proved to be as large or as systematically brutal as the Murphy family's enterprise. The legal proceedings were complicated by the fact that many of the Murphy family's actions had been technically legal under the broad powers granted to religious rehabilitation institutions. Prosecutors had to craft new legal theories to address crimes that existing law had not anticipated, setting precedents that would influence criminal justice for decades to come. The defense attorneys for the various defendants attempted to argue that their clients had believed they were participating in legitimate rehabilitation efforts, but the overwhelming evidence of systematic cruelty and the financial records showing enormous profits from human suffering made such claims impossible to sustain. The sentences handed down were as severe as the law allowed, though many observers felt that even the harshest punishments were inadequate given the scope and duration of the crimes. Shaw Murphy was executed by hanging in 1868, maintaining his innocence to the end and claiming that this execution was part of a conspiracy against true Christianity. His final statement from the gallows included a lengthy theological justification for his actions and a prediction that history would vindicate his methods of moral rehabilitation. Thomas Murphy received life imprisonment and died in Singeing Prison in 1882, reportedly killed by fellow inmates who had learned the nature of his crimes and decided to dispense their own form of justice. The corrupt officials who had protected the Murphy family faced varying degrees of punishment, though many escaped serious consequences through political connections or by fleeing the jurisdiction before they could be arrested. Judge Prescott's suicide had eliminated one of the key figures in the corruption network, while Captain Dunham's cooperation with prosecutors earned him a reduced sentence that many felt was far too lenient given his central role in supplying victims to the operation. The scandal effectively ended the careers of dozens of politicians and judges, though few faced serious criminal penalties beyond the loss of their positions and public disgrace. Several prominent businessmen and religious leaders were convicted on lesser charges and received sentences ranging from heavy fines to short prison terms. But the nature of the evidence against them suggested that their involvement had been far more extensive than the courts were able to prove. The social and political connections that had protected these men during their criminal activities also served to limit their punishment once their crimes were exposed, demonstrating the persistent power of wealth and influence even in the face of overwhelming evidence of moral corruption. The Murphy family case had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the criminal prosecutions, fundamentally changing how American society viewed religious institutions, moral reform movements, and the treatment of vulnerable populations. The case exposed fundamental flaws in the systems designed to protect women and led to significant reforms in how such institutions were regulated and overseen, while also contributing to growing skepticism about the moral reform movement and religious authority in general. New York State responded to the scandal by completely restructuring its oversight of religious and charitable institutions, implementing reforms that required regular inspections, detailed record-keeping, and independent oversight boards for any institution that housed vulnerable populations. These reforms, known as the Murphy Laws, became a model for other states and significantly improved conditions in legitimate institutions, while making it much more difficult for criminal operations to hide behind religious facades. The laws required that all such institutions submit to unannounced inspections by state officials, maintain detailed records of all residents and their treatment, and allow unrestricted access to any resident by family members or legal representatives. The case also influenced the development of women's rights movements, as activists used the Murphy family's crimes as evidence of the systematic oppression and exploitation of women in American society. The survivors who testified in the trials became powerful advocates for legal and social reforms that would protect other women from similar exploitation. While their stories provided compelling evidence for arguments about women's need for greater legal rights and social protections, the case demonstrated how women's lack of legal standing and social power made them vulnerable to systematic abuse by those in positions of authority. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other women's rights leaders used the Murphy case as a rallying cry for legal reforms that would give women greater control over their own lives and protect them from arbitrary imprisonment and abuse. The case provided clear evidence that existing legal protections for women were inadequate and that the moral reform movement's emphasis on controlling women's behavior had created opportunities for exploitation rather than genuine protection. The building that had housed the House of Religious Correction was demolished in 1869, and the city ordered that no structure could be built on the site for at least 50 years as a mark of respect for the victims and a reminder of the horrors that had occurred there. The lot remained empty until the 1920s, when it was finally developed into a small park dedicated to the memory of the Murphy family's victims. Even today, many New Yorkers avoid the area, claiming that it feels wrong or haunted. Though they often don't know the historical reasons for their discomfort, the Murphy family's story became a cautionary tale that was told and retold across America, serving as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the ease with which religious rhetoric could be used to disguise the most heinous crimes. The case influenced literature, with several novels of the period drawing inspiration from the scandal, though none captured the full horror of what had actually occurred. The story also became part of American folklore, with various versions spreading across the country and serving as a reminder of the potential for evil that exists when good people choose to remain silent. Perhaps most significantly, the Murphy family case demonstrated how systematic evil could operate under the cover of moral respectability for decades without being detected or stopped, revealing the importance of transparency, accountability, and skepticism in evaluating institutions that claim moral authority. The case showed that the most dangerous criminals were not the obvious villains, but those who could disguise their cruelty as virtue and use society's own institutions as weapons against the vulnerable. The investigation also revealed how corruption could spread through an entire system, creating networks of complicity that protected wrongdoers and silenced victims. The Murphy family could not have operated for 33 years without the active participation of dozens of officials and the passive complicity of hundreds more who chose to look the other way rather than investigate disturbing rumors or question suspicious circumstances. Detective James Flanagan, whose investigation had finally exposed the Murphy family's crimes, was promoted to captain and spent the remainder of his career investigating similar cases across the country. He established protocols for investigating institutional abuse that are still used by law enforcement today, and his techniques helped expose several other criminal operations that had been operating under religious or charitable covers. Flanagan's methods emphasized the importance of listening to victims' accounts, following financial records, and looking for patterns of behavior that suggested systematic rather than isolated abuse. Father Michael Ali, whose documentation of disappearances had supported Flanagan's investigation, became a leading advocate for reform within the Catholic Church and worked to establish safeguards that would prevent similar abuses in religious institutions. His efforts contributed to the development of more rigorous oversight procedures and reporting requirements that made it much more difficult for criminal operations to hide behind religious authority. Just when we thought the full horror of the Murphy family's crimes had been revealed, the discovery of their hidden archives in 1934 would expose even more disturbing aspects of their operation. If you're finding this story as chilling as we are, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Your engagement helps us continue investigating these forgotten horrors of American history. In 1934, nearly 70 years after the Murphy family's downfall, construction workers renovating the building that had been erected on the site of their former operation made a discovery that would reopen wounds that many had hoped were finally healed. Behind a false wall in what had once been the basement of the House of Religious Correction, workers found a hidden archive containing hundreds of documents, photographs, and personal items that revealed aspects of the Murphy family's operation that had never been exposed during the original trials. The hidden archive included detailed psychological profiles of victims, experimental records documenting various methods of breaking human will, and correspondence with similar operations across the country and even in Europe. Perhaps most disturbing were the photographs, hundreds of images documenting the systematic abuse and degradation of victims over the course of decades. These photographs had apparently been taken for the entertainment of clients and as records of the institution's rehabilitation methods. But they provided modern investigators with evidence of crimes that had been too shocking for Victorian-era prosecutors to present in court. The archive also contained extensive correspondence between the Murphy family and operators of similar institutions in London, Paris, and other European cities, revealing that their operation was part of an international network of exploitation that had operated under various religious and charitable facades. The letters discussed techniques for breaking victims, methods for avoiding law enforcement attention, and business arrangements for trading women between different operations. This correspondence suggested that the Murphy family's crimes were not an isolated American phenomenon, but part of a broader pattern of exploitation that had infected charitable and religious institutions across the Western world. Among the most chilling discoveries were Shaw Murphy's personal journals, which provided insight into the theological and philosophical justifications he had developed for the family's crimes. His writings revealed a man who had convinced himself that he was conducting legitimate religious experiments in human nature and redemption, testing the limits of human endurance and faith through systematic torture. His journals contain detailed observations about the psychological effects of various forms of abuse and his theories about the relationship between suffering and spiritual purification. The archive also included financial records that had not been discovered during the original investigation, showing that the Murphy family's operation had been even more profitable than previously known. These records revealed additional sources of income, including the sale of victims to international trafficking networks and participation in illegal medical experiments conducted by physicians who were studying the effects of various forms of physical and psychological trauma. The financial scope of the operation was staggering, with profits that would be worth tens of millions of dollars in modern currency. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the personal items that had belonged to victims. Letters from home that had never been delivered, religious medallions and family photographs that had been confiscated during intake, and diary entries that some women had managed to write in secret during their captivity. These items provided names and faces for many victims who had previously been known only as numbers in the Murphy family's records, allowing historians to begin the process of documenting individual stories and honoring the memory of those who had suffered and died in the institution. The discovery of the hidden archive prompted a new investigation led by the New York City Police Department's newly formed Historical Crimes Unit, which was tasked with documenting the full scope of the Murphy family's crimes and identifying any additional victims or accomplices. This investigation, conducted with modern forensic techniques and historical research methods, revealed that the Murphy family's operation had been even larger and more systematic than the original. Prosecutors had been able to prove. The new investigation also uncovered evidence that some members of the Murphy family's network had escaped justice and continued their criminal activities in other locations after the original scandal. Several unsolved disappearances and mysterious deaths in other cities showed patterns that suggested the involvement of former Murphy family associates, indicating that the network's influence had extended far beyond what had been revealed during the original trials. The Murphy family case continues to raise disturbing questions about the nature of evil and the capacity for ordinary people to participate in or ignore systematic atrocities. Modern psychologists and criminologists have studied the case as an example of how authority figures can exploit their positions to commit crimes that would be impossible for individuals acting alone. While historians have used it to understand the social and political conditions that allowed such operations to flourish in 19th century America, the case also serves as a reminder of the importance of skepticism and accountability in evaluating institutions that claim moral authority. The Murphy family's ability to operate for over 3 decades under the cover of religious respectability show easily good intentions can be perverted and how dangerous it can be to grant unchecked power to those who claim to be working for moral or spiritual purposes. Perhaps most troubling is the evidence that the Murphy family's operation was not unique, but part of a broader pattern of exploitation that affected charitable and religious institutions across America and Europe. The correspondence found in the hidden archive suggests that similar operations existed in many major cities, protected by networks of corruption and enabled by legal systems that granted extraordinary power to religious and charitable organizations. The Murphy family's victims were not just the women who suffered and died in their institution, but all of society, which was corrupted by the existence of such systematic evil and the complicity required to maintain it. The case demonstrates how the abuse of the most vulnerable members of society ultimately threatens the moral foundation of civilization itself, requiring constant vigilance and courage from those who would protect the innocent. The legacy of the Murphy family case continues to influence modern efforts to protect vulnerable populations and ensure accountability in institutions that serve them. The reforms implemented in response to their crimes established principles of transparency, oversight, and individual rights that remain essential to preventing similar abuses today. This mystery shows us how easily evil can disguise itself as virtue and how the most vulnerable members of society, can be systematically destroyed by the very institutions that claim to protect them. The Murphy family story is not just about individual criminals, but about the failure of an entire system to protect those who most needed protection. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there are still secrets buried in New York's past? The Murphy family operated for over 3 decades. How many other similar operations might have existed that were never discovered? The evidence suggests that their network extended far beyond what was ever prosecuted. Leave your comment below and share your thoughts on this dark chapter of American history. If you enjoy stories that examine the hidden horrors of our past, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest secrets. Share this story with someone who appreciates true crime and historical mysteries. Together, we can ensure that these stories are never forgotten, and that history's lessons continue to warn us about the potential for evil that exists when good people choose to remain silent. The Murphy family's legacy reminds us that the price of protection is eternal vigilance, and that those who claim to speak for God or morality must be watched most carefully of all. In remembering their victims, we honor not just their memory, but our commitment to ensuring that such horrors never happen again. See you in the next video, where we'll continue to explore the dark secrets that history tried to bury.